Yeah, so I think like a lot of my work as like an activist up until now has been about like learning mostly because I'm a college student. So I think a lot of my decisions are like based on like what can I study that I can then like act upon and like kind of like decisions that I'm making for like my career that I think are like will inform like an activist life after college, so like taking a lot of classes on like colonialism and like human rights and like our relationship to the environment and to land. I think for me, any work that I have started doing like outside of just education has been, focused on like nonprofits and things that are like for more like human rights and like indigenous rights and stuff like that, and things that I can like apply everything that I'm learning to like actual work. And I am pretty young still. And so I also don't really know how, like what my place is yet and like what my role is. But I think like up until now, a lot of it has just been like, unlearning things and like thinking of things in like a perspective that isn't usually like highlighted in our country, or like things that aren't maybe apparent. I think like a success, I guess, in my career is just like understanding what it is that I want to do. So like I'm working with like the Center for World Indigenous Studies now, and I think that like what I'm working on now is like about environmental justice and like environmental racism as it applies to like indigenous cultures and stuff like food sovereignty and like relationship to the land. So honestly, I think like for me at this point in like my age, a success has been just like understanding like what I want to do in terms of like activism and like what I want to do in terms of like human rights and stuff like that. Working a lot with like indigenous rights and like indigenous ways of knowing and like indigenous histories in different countries and stuff. And I think one big learning lesson for me, and I guess almost like a failure, just like a learning lesson, is just like um the importance of like not generalizing on these topics and not saying just like all indigenous people are like X, or like this is like what indigenous knowledge is. I think for me it's been very important to learn like not to kind of like even as this like someone like trying to advocate for these things, not like fall into that trap of like the stereotypes or like romanticizing like indigenous ways of knowing. I think like for me that's definitely been an important like learning step, because I remember like in class once I was like, oh, indigenous communities have like this relationship to the land, and then it's like important, well, it's like indigenous communities aren't like this monolith and like this just one abstract thing. I think for me it's been important to like understand like not the importance of like not generalizing on those things and like actually learning about like individual communities and like individual cultures, and like, and so I think that for me has been definitely been like an important like learning step, and like something I guess I failed at the beginning was just kind of like making these broad assumptions about what I was learning and applying it to just like everything in general. I guess like one obstacle is just like understanding like my place and like my like how I'm approaching these topics, because like I don't know, it's just like an interesting like coming from, I am like a Hispanic and like Latino woman, but I'm also white, and I'm at a predominantly like white university learning about all these things, and like I have a lot of, I guess I've like had a lot of privilege in my life, and obviously like my life is, but like, so it's just like interesting like understanding like what my role is and like coming in as an outsider into like a lot of topics that I'm studying. So I think just like, understanding like my role in other communities and like making sure that I'm doing things for the right reasons, and then I'm putting like other like communities before myself, just like, and just like, yeah, being aware of everything, especially like I'm an anthropology student, and anthropology has like a lot of history of like white supremacy and like colonialism when it was like first a discipline. So I think again, understanding like the role of being like an anthropologist in this field, and just like making sure I have like my head in the right place and I'm doing things for the reasons. And yeah, definitely I'm still learning, but just kind of trying to make sure that the information that I'm taking in is also is produced by the people that are on the front lines of all this. like I think their role right now is predominantly like their students. That's kind of like a big identity for them. So I think like learning to unlearn a lot of things that they've been taught, like, you know, US history, like what does that mean in like most like schools like in the United States, for example, or like I think just like understanding that there's so many narratives of like things that they've been taught, and like kind of seeking out different voices and like different histories that have historically been like forgotten or erased or oppressed. So I think like for me that's definitely been an important thing, like learning to like unlearn the things that I've been taught, and then like seeking out other perspectives of like the world. Um and yeah, I don't know, just like learn a lot, read a lot of things, do things that you're interested in. But at the same time, like pace yourself, um, you know, be proud of like where you are, and like just acknowledging that you want to do this, I think is a very important thing, and like realizing that it's very easy to overwhelmed with like how, you know, what everything is connected, and like everything kind of has faults and has roots and different structures. I don't know, it's just, but I guess like some first steps is just like yeah, like seek out other voices and like seek out other histories, and then also realize like the intersectionality of like so many issues in the world, like climate change and like indigenous rights and women's rights, and like all these things are connected, and it's just important to like understand the foundation of what of all these things. But yeah, but pace yourselves and don't get overwhelmed.